The Istanbul Cipher. Chapter 20. I packed like someone who didn't want to admit he was leaving. My satchel sat by the door, half-zipped. A few shirts, passport, toothbrush, my charger. No ceremony, no goodbyes. I didn't want to wake the kids, if any of them even slept here last night. I moved around the flat quietly, touching things like they were artifacts. The cracked ceramic cup Emre fixed with resin glue. Sibel's thumb drive, still resting beside the router. A copy of Ayla's site map taped to the wall. The ink had faded where the sun hit it. On the counter sat my notebook. I flipped it open without meaning to. Half sketches, jotted notes, reminders to email parents, ideas for a digital civics unit I'd never write. Then further back, layers of Istanbul. Old sewer maps, Ottoman surveying references. The first rough mock-up of the AR mosaic interface. I turned to a blank page and wrote, "Peter Pan grew up, but maybe Neverland needed him more once he did." Ridiculous. Pretentious. But the line had lodged in my head since Layla read me that first verse from the mosaic. We were many names. One prayer. I looked around the flat one more time. I hadn't just built lessons here. I'd built a belief. That they could change things. That maybe I wasn't too late to help them try. Then I zipped the bag closed and left the notebook behind. The satchel felt heavier than it should have. The weight of surrender, maybe. Or cowardice. It's not cowardice, I told myself as I stepped into the stairwell. It's pragmatism, survival. But the thought didn't sit right. Not anymore. Not after everything we'd seen. Not after Anahid's whisper. Prayers don't care who remembers. They wait. Downstairs, the early ferry horn echoed across the Bosphorus like a last call. I walked faster. Maybe this was the end. Maybe Istanbul was never mine to stay in. But even as I crossed the street, I couldn't stop wondering, what if I'm still needed? Not as a teacher, as a witness. And that was the thought that followed me to the water. The Bosphorus was slate-gray and restless, like the inside of my skull. I boarded the ferry with a handful of commuters, men in jackets too thin for the wind, women balancing teacups on their palms like they'd done it since birth. No one spoke. Just the slap of water and the hum of diesel engines. I stood near the railing, collar high against the gust. On any other day, this would have been a breath, a pause. I used to love Istanbul from the water, its contradictions stacked like layers of a baklava, domes and cranes, history and hustle, fading and becoming all at once. But today, it just felt like distance. Niazi lived on the Asian side, in a quiet pocket of Kadıköy where bookstores still outnumbered coffee chains. He didn't ask why I was coming when I texted, just sent a location pin and wrote, "Bring whatever you're not sure you should carry." When I stepped off the ferry, the air had shifted. Less salt, more soil. Istanbul's breath, but older. The side that remembered before the bridges. His house was tucked behind a crumbling garden wall. Ivy, sun-damaged history books in the windows, a brass door knocker in the shape of a lion with its mouth closed. I found him in the side yard, with pruning shears and a fig tree that looked half dead. He didn't look up as I approached. "Thought fig trees didn't survive frost," I said. "They don't," Niazi replied, still snipping. "But the roots do. You cut it back, let it look ruined. Then, if it wants, it comes back." We stood in silence while he cleared a few brittle branches. Eventually, he straightened and dusted his hands on his trousers. "You're leaving." It wasn't a question, just the kind of truth an old man doesn't waste breath dressing up. I nodded once. "They're sealing everything. The center, the project, my visa. There's nothing left to teach here." He raised an eyebrow and walked inside without responding. I followed, reluctantly. A voice in my chest whispered, "You didn't come for permission. You came for permission not to quit." Inside, the house smelled like paper, cardamom, and dust, proof that time had passed, but nothing important had left. Professor Niazi led me to the back room, a kind of organized chaos. Filing cabinets half open, books stacked on the floor like archaeological digs, an ancient samovar puffing steam in the corner. He motioned for me to sit, then handed me a chipped glass of tea. I didn't sip, just stared at the steam, fingers wrapped around the warmth like it could explain what the hell I was doing here. "I thought maybe I could do more from somewhere else," I said finally. Niazi settled into the opposite chair with a sigh so quiet it sounded like the room exhaling. "You mean safer ground?" "They've shut us down. The youth center, the app. My credentials are under review. I've got 48 hours before I'm strongly encouraged to depart voluntarily." I forced a smile. "I've been fired before, but never by a country." He didn't flinch, just pulled open a drawer and extracted a weathered folder bound in black twine. From it, he slid out a newspaper clipping, yellowed with age. "Look at this." It was a photograph, grainy but powerful. Half a dozen students standing on the rooftop of a collapsing stone building, fists raised. A banner hung behind them, painted in broad, defiant strokes. "The city forgets. We don't." I looked closer. The address printed in the caption, Karaka Sokak, 11B. My throat tightened. "That's the same block," I said. "The church." He nodded. 1969. They tried to bulldoze it then, too. Said it was unsafe. Students occupied it for 12 days until the paperwork mysteriously vanished. "Did they save it?" "No," he said, "but they delayed it long enough for someone to document what mattered." I leaned back, something shifting in my chest. "This isn't a lesson plan anymore, Zach." It never was. You're not just a teacher, you're a witness. And sometimes, witnesses are the most dangerous people in the room. I stared at the photo again. The city forgets. Maybe. But maybe memory didn't need permission. Maybe it just needed someone to speak. I didn't speak for the rest of the ferry ride back across the Bosphorus. The water slapped against the hull, rougher than usual. Gray skies above, gray sea below. Istanbul blurred at the edges, like the city was holding its breath. By the time I reached my flat, the weight in my chest hadn't lifted. I stepped inside, kicked off my shoes, and dropped my bag by the door. The apartment was dim and still. A half-drunk mug of tea sat cold on the windowsill. My suitcase, still half-packed, leaned against the couch like it was daring me to finish the job. I sat down and pulled the old clipping from my coat pocket, smoothing it on the table. Those kids from 1969 stared back at me, full of fire, full of risk. Not one of them looked like they thought they'd win. But they'd showed up anyway. Isn't that the job? I thought. To show up when it matters, not just when it's safe? I booted up my laptop. For a moment, it hesitated, like even the machine had doubts. Then the screen flickered to life. Most of the networks were gone, scrubbed. But Emre's encrypted server, buried under layers of spoofed traffic and dummy ports, still held. I connected. A loading symbol spun for several seconds. Then a prompt blinked to life. Fragment alignment pattern detected, key confirmed. My heart kicked. I sat forward as the data reconstructed on screen. The mosaic overlay, starpoint geometry, the faint blue line tracing the cistern path beneath the condemned foundation. Then, one phrase emerged in pulsing white text. Unity hides where walls once divided. I stared at it, my breath shallow. Not just a message, a map. A map someone wanted remembered. Someone buried beneath walls built to separate. And for the first time in days, I didn't feel alone. The city moved differently at night. Its rhythm slowed but didn't sleep. Trams hummed past closed bakeries, cats prowled the sidewalks like sentinels, and minarets glowed faintly against the haze. Somewhere beneath that quiet surface, my students were still awake, still fighting in their own quiet ways. Layla lit a candle beside her grandmother's hospital bed, her face still, almost unreadable. From the hallway I saw her lips moving, maybe a prayer, maybe one of the Mosaic verses, reborn in whispered resistance. She didn't see me pass. I didn't interrupt. Elsewhere, Cibel sat alone in the back of a near-empty tram. She held her grandfather's battered journal open in her lap, flipping pages with the kind of reverence usually reserved for scripture. Outside the window, graffiti-covered walls rolled past, phrases half-erased, colors dulled. They erase everything they fear, I thought. Across town, Emre hunched in front of a dormant screen. He looked like a ghost in the bluish light. His hands hovered above the keyboard, frozen. Then, slowly, deliberately, he typed, "Start sequence 47, B." The screen blinked. Code bloomed back to life. In a quiet square, Ayla walked the perimeter of the sealed site. Her gaze swept over every detail: fence joins, drain access points, power conduits. She scribbled in her notebook, her breath fogging slightly in the night air. She paused once, looked back at the building, and nodded to herself like a chess player seeing 3 moves ahead. They were all scattered, but none of them had surrendered. That mattered. Back in my flat, I poured the last of the tea, now lukewarm and bitter. My hand hovered over my field notebook, the one I'd almost left behind. I opened to a blank page and scrawled a single word across the top. Now. We'd lost so much: momentum, tools, allies. But in each of them, I saw the ember still burning. They were never just kids. They were architects of memory, and we were out of time to doubt that. The backup server flared to life like a heartbeat returning. I stared at the screen, blinking as a pale wireframe of the sealed site took shape. Then, just beneath the foundation, a vein of red pulsed into view, not a glitch, a path. The cistern. A prompt flickered. Fragment alignment pattern detected, key confirmed. A message unfolded beneath the map, the words etched like they'd been waiting years to be read. Unity hides where walls once divided. I sat back, my breath caught somewhere between disbelief and awe. This wasn't a broken file. It was intentional. A living message embedded in code and story, left by people who knew they'd be erased and planned for it. I opened my recording app and hit the button. "This isn't about recovering the past," I said into the mic. My voice was low, steady. "It's about refusing to let someone else decide what counts as real." They're not just remembering the past. They're rewriting the future. I can't walk away from that. I won't. I saved the file, closed the laptop, and picked up my phone. The message I sent wasn't poetic. No quotes, no riddles. Just 5 words. To Layla, to Emre, to Ayla, to Sybil. I'm in. One last time. One by one, the read receipts came through. No replies. Not yet. But they knew what it meant. I walked to the window and looked out across the Bosphorus. The water was dark, stirred by a whisper of wind. On the far shore, Istanbul's old skyline flickered like memory refusing to sleep. They can seal the doors. They can strip our tools, but they can't stop what we've already seen. We were going back in, and this time, we weren't asking permission.